So the next story, in terms of the a key kind of a story of historic legend about women of legend in terms of Roman women, is the very famous story of the rape of Lucretia. And I think it's really significant to think that this is actually a story that Romans would have grown up knowing, um, and um, and was an established kind of part of their founding history. So again, this is part of Livy's history of Rome. Um, this is a little bit further down in his history. Where we were previously about 753 BC with Romulus, and now we've had the reign of the Seven Kings, and it's the we're in about 509 BC, and the seventh king of Rome is a man called Tarquinius Superbus, or often referred to as Tarquin the Proud, and he is the king at his time at this time. And the story describes the rape of Lucretia, a noble patrician married woman, and by Tarquin the Proud's son, who's called Sextus Tarquinius. And Sextus Tarquinius was actually a friend, and currently in the army with Lucretia's husband, Tarquinius Collatinus. And you can see by Tarquinius Collatinus's name that he is also of the Tarquin family. So Sextus Tarquinius, who rapes Lucretia, and Tarquinius Collatinus are actually cousins. So, which makes, probably to a modern audience, this even more shocking. Um, so, the section included in the source booklet um, essentially describes the lead up to the rape, and then so 1.57, and then the rape itself. So the first thing to know, after we hear the description of the young princes, i.e. Sextus Tarquinius and also Tarquinius Collatinus, and there were some other men as well, they're at a camp because there's a war going on at the time. However, there has been a, they're not required to fight at the moment, so they've been in the um, in the they've been at the camp, and they've had a lot of leisure time. So they've been drinking and partying, um, and dining, and they start to come up essentially with a bet, like describing whose wife is the most virtuous. And they all rile each other up, and each man, we see here, extolled their wife and praised how wonderful they were. So there's a bit of kind of youthful male rivalry here, comparing wives. And Collatinus describes how his wife Lucretia is the most virtuous of them all. So they go to test that, and they speed off to Rome, probably very drunk. As it says here, they were all fired up with wine, and they kick off on their horses and speed off to Rome. And it's obviously late at night, and they find Lucretia, um, rather than being at a sumptuous banquet like some of the other wives, um, she is at home, completely occupied with her spinning. And I think this is our kind of first insight into what was really important here for Roman women, that is part of her virtue, part of her ideal quality, and expectation of her as a wife is that she's a good spinner and a wool worker. And so here she is, not only is she spinning, she's going right through late into the night. She's got her maids around her as well. They are toiling by lamplight. So she is a very loyal and virtuous wife here, because she is doing what she should be doing as a wife, Meanwhile, the other wives and the king's daughters-in-law are all off kind of drinking and spending time with um, their peers at banquets and things like that. So, as the Tarquini, that's Sextus Tarquinius and also Tarquinius Collatinus, her husband, as they approach, and they obviously see that Collatinus is he wins the bet. His wife is the most virtuous. But it's at that point when they go to visit their house and they find her weaving or spinning that Sextus Tarquinius is overcome by lust. So here we get an insight into bad conduct, essentially, of a male. What is Livy here is highlighting, this is not ideal conduct from Sextus Tarquinius. You notice that by things like the language here, um, seized by a terrible longing to defile Lucretia by force, i.e., rape her. And so this word defile, I think, is a very powerful verb used by Livy here. Um, and he has this longing because of her beauty, but also her chastity, also her virtuous nature. She's not out at banquets, she's at home, staying loyal to her husband who's been at war, and she's spinning. And so it is that draws him to this woman. So again, highlighting ideal qualities of Roman women: beauty and chastity, pudicitia. 1.58, then it starts to turn very dark, the story, and describes the rape itself. Obviously, he's been lusting after Lucretia, Sextus Tarquinius, and he decides to go back to the house, even though he hadn't been invited. She still welcomes him in. So here we get an insight again into Lucretia as a good wife. She offers him a friendly welcome. She gives him a guest room, gives him dinner, and so she performs her wifely duties there. Um, and it's at this point, once she goes to bed, that he decides to rape her. And the rape here, I think the thing to notice here, because we're getting an insight into really bad male conduct here, is um, the use of violent threat. He comes with a sword, he knows exactly what he's doing, and he tells her that. He goes in straight away, puts his hand on her breast, so he's already violating her, and he says that she will die if she does not sleep with him. And I think this bit is the most one of the most significant parts of the story is the fact that she refuses. She can initially, she can only see death. However, she still thinks, no, I cannot do this, because she is a noble, loyal wife. And he tries and tries and tries, but even though she's not touched by the fear of death, he starts to come up with other ploys, and it's at the point when he threatens her with killing her slave or her servant and laying him naked beside her body, her dead body, um, that Lucretia decides that she has no choice. And I think this is again gives us really interesting insight into the Romans, because this is very much a status thing. It's one thing to commit adultery, it's another thing to commit adultery with a slave who is well below her status as a patrician woman. And so that's even more frowned upon than any adultery with a citizen male. And so she knows that her reputation will be ruined. She knows that her reputation of her husband will be ruined, and she knows that the reputation of her family and of her father would be ruined if this was to be the conclusions that people made. So she decides then that she must give in to him, and so he rapes her. And I think this line here tells us very much about, again, male um, bad conduct. Livy has said this, quite a strong statement. Tarquinius left, reveling in his successful conquest, very militaristic uh, um, noun there, of a woman's honor, and it's that thing exactly. This is the bad conduct. He has essentially stripped her of her honor, of her pudicitia, and of her virtue. Um, and um, and Lucretia knows this, and so she sends a message immediately to both her father and her husband. And they come quickly, and she explains what's happened. And I think this bit here is interesting. So Spurius Lucretius, that's her father. He comes with an attendant, and then Coltinus, her husband, comes with a man called Lucius Junius Brutus, and I will explain a little bit more about Brutus in a minute. And they come immediately, and she's absolutely devastated. And we get a lot of talk here about virtue, and the loss of virtue, and the impact it's going to have on those two men, um, as well as her own reputation. Obviously, here we see her proclaim that it's, her body's been violated, but her heart is innocent. And I think this bit here is really interesting, where actually um, both father and husband, explain to her that actually um, it's it it's not your fault. They turn the blame from the coerced to the coercer, and they understand her. So actually, they uh, can empathize with her or sympathize with her. And so here, virtue is very much tied up with the mind, rather than the body here, and they can make the distinction between the two. However, for Lucretia, she knows still that her reputation is absolute mud, and she needs to be punished. So her virtue, because it's gone, um, must now be punished. And at that point, it's when she kills herself. She commits suicide. She takes out a knife which she'd hidden beneath her clothes, showing that she was always intending on doing that, and she thrusts it into her heart. It's a very dramatic scene. Um, and I think something to note here is that suicide, like that, is actually a very masculine suicide, by stabbing herself. You have to be very strong to do that. And so in the end, she actually uses quite a masculine form of suicide. Um, so, um, and then 1.59 is the aftermath of this story. Um, the all of the people in Rome come out to see this, what is described as a spectacle, enthralled. It's strange. It's strange because there's a woman there, um, who's killed herself, with a knife, and it's also shameful because of what's happened, the fact that she's been raped, and her virtue is gone. But notice here how Livy uses the term, each one lamented the prince's crime and violence. This is not ideal conduct of a man. This is not something that men should be able to get away with, as she is a married patrician woman. And it's at this point that Brutus, who I mentioned before, actually uses this as a kind of political maneuver. They've been wanting to get rid of Tarquin the Proud, who I mentioned before, the seventh king of Rome, for a long time. He'd been an awful king, and so Brutus, who decides to use this, to then rally troops and to go and attack the king and the king's family, because obviously it was the king's son who raped Lucretia. And he uses this as a kind of kickstart to what then became a war in which the great Roman Republic was begun. So from 509 BC up until Augustus takes power in 27 BC, Rome becomes a republic. There are no more kings. The seven kings of Rome have finished. And so this story is very, very significant. in Roman history.